Thank you very much for waiting. We are very sorry we are starting late, but Mr. N.K. Singh has many engagements and he was delayed at his last stop, and we are delighted that he is now here with us. The relationship between center and state can't always be said to be great. There's a natural tension, as they say, and politics can come in the way. In a democracy, votes have to be sought. Alas, they can be competitively bought. Not just by good policy as they ought, and then development can come to naught. Our constitution was well designed, but of course we would always find defense is tough against a devious mind, but we shouldn't be left behind. One hopeful sign is GST. It's administered permanently. The council meets and then decides, and everyone else then abides. If by such means, center and state don't compete but collaborate, development will then proceed and our nation will succeed. Good center-state collaboration is important for our nation. To elucidate, no one is greater than our lustrous illuminator. The expert that we now bring is none other than N.K. Singh. He was a brilliant technocrat. The politicians would send in to bat when the pitch was very rough and the going might get tough. But all the same, he'd always score and then was asked to do much more. And so he was a steady riser and even the PM's special advisor. And then he was given the mission of chairing committees and the finance commission. His resume is a lengthy list. He's an erudite economist. He's pragmatic and visionary. His analytical rigor and objectivity make him the perfect chair, wise, effective, and fair. And he has fulfilled his greatest mission with the 15th Finance Commission. Regional development should now be great, with increased grants to every state. Local bodies get their share, and this we hope will get them where they really need to be for all of us to clearly see a future that is fair and bright, avoiding poverty and blight. Performance-based grants are very wise, and they would surely incentivize reforms that we badly need, and without which we can't succeed. Export promotion is a major goal, for which states can now play a role. Before you think I'll go on much more, I graciously cede the floor. And don't you think it would be great if together, center and state, stop competing and cooperate? Let's hope we don't wait and wait. Thank you. Sure.
Well, thank you very much. As usual, Nadir, I think that words cannot be a substitute for poetry. And so I must pledge really already before I say anything. But thank you for your generous compliments, which cannot be in any way replicated. I think that it would be, I will make a couple of comments and I will look forward to somewhat not only addressing your questions, Nadir, but equally if anybody else wishes to ask anything that would be perhaps more interesting than what I say. So we know very well that the broad issue of center-state relations is embedded in our constitution. It is fortified. And I think that broadly speaking, we recognize that India is a union of states. It's a federation, but not a confederation, which means that the states have not come together in any manner when the union was created, but it is held together. The states may be destructible, but the union is indestructible. I think this is a fundamental difference between our model of federation compared to various other models in which could be the other way around. Now, I think that we've had a very robust history of roughly over 75 years in which this relationship has evolved. It began, to some extent, it began even before the Indian Constitution was adopted. It began by the Government of India Act of 1935. If you look at today's Constitution now, you will find that a lot of it might bear resemblance to the Government of India Act of 1935. Indeed, the debates in the Constituent Assembly, which really dealt with the center-state relations, are reflected also the sort of previous acts which dealt with, broadly speaking, the division and the distribution of resources between the center and the states. For this distribution to take place, one of the balancing wheels in the Constitution, as it was called, is the Finance Commission. I had the privilege to chair the 15th Finance Commission. My award is for six years and not 5. And therefore, my awards will hold good till 2025. And they have been, the financial part of the award have been fully accepted, as has been the tradition, and are currently under implementation. Broadly speaking, I want to touch on 3 important elements before I. One is that, are there improvements in the center-state relationship matrix which is possible? And what are those improvements which can take place? You mentioned per se, Nadir, that one of the good examples of comparative, not competitive, but cooperative federalism was the working of the GST Council. Indeed, the GST Council is a recent body, but be said to the credit of that body that there has never been any voting. It has been decision unanimously taken. It is therefore a good model, which I believe, based on the experience which we have had with the GST model, we can replicate in other segments. We can replicate it in agriculture, we can replicate it in the social sector, and certainly we need to replicate it in the digital economy, because that's the direction in which we seem to be proceeding. The green economy, particularly renewable fuels, the movement away from fossil fuel, and as India is committed to a net zero, and India has orchestrated a very credible plan, the Prime Minister's initiative on the Solar Alliance, the Prime Minister's recent initiatives which he has taken in Bali, and also the thoughts which were reflected not only in Glasgow, but the thoughts which have recently been articulated by the government in Egypt, as they concluded, really brings out the fact that the daunting challenge which is involved in orderly movement from an era of fossil fuel to the era of renewable energy. One of the key areas in that area of renewable energy, Nadir, is the whole philosophy behind agriculture. And to make agriculture less dependent on fossil fuel, on crop diversifications, on patterns of cultivation which are less dependent on water, I think that India has taken a lead under the Prime Minister's leadership and the making the next year to be the year of the millet. The milletization, so to say, and millets are in multiple forms, will make a qualitative difference in the way in which agriculture is harnessed to the advantage of the 45% of India's population, which are still dependent on agriculture, even though agriculture contributes only 14% to India's GDP. So I think that the philosophy of the good working of the GST Council, with some changes, can be replicated in other segments of the economy, particularly, as I mentioned, is agriculture is one. So that was one new dimension in which we can take the consensual process forward. The second is the area of exports. Now, if you look at India's export data, it will not be surprising if you come to the conclusion that 80% of India's exports only come from 6 states. 22 states have negligible contribution to India's export, not only export realization, but certainly way below India's export potential. So I do believe that how to harness the export capability of the states which are no more participant in India's export activity, how to really mainstream them. And I think that there happen to be some very, very important states of India. I particularly believe that the northeastern states of India, which I have had the privilege to go during my period as the chairman of the Finance Commission, has a huge, huge export multiplier. So harnessing India's and augmenting India's export capability requires incentivization of states and bringing the states which are not part of these 6 states into a process by which they can become very, very active players. Now, one of the things which we have talked about, Nader, in the past is the multiplicity of too many entities, not only by exporters, and I now move on to investments, but the investment community has felt that the number of permissions by central entities and by state entities still add up to one too many. And no matter how much government has withdrawn from the business of business, nonetheless, the debilitating really features of these kinds of permission culture, if I may say so, is a negative factor. Now, I think that the Prime Minister must be complimented that very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a very important decision which needs to be discussed more is the integrated online submission of all approval of center, states, and all other regulatory entities into one coherent piece. Now, when this is implemented, it is going to simplify, and states will therefore find it much easier to not only attract investments, but to become partners as far as exports are concerned. I will go a step further. Added to this, I think how to foster a culture of partnership, public-private partnership by states, with the center as some kind of a guidance mechanism embedded in a separate act called the Public-Private Partnership Act, will really bring about much greater coherence of policy, embed trust, and embed the adherence to contractual obligations. Now that you were generous enough to tell those whom I had kept waiting, or where I was, well, I was in a similar thing, the Indo-Singapore Strategic Dialogue, but this is one of the suggestions which I made and which really found a great degree of resonance, because Singapore has passed through this experience of broken contracts and retrospective changes in contracts. So I really feel that taking this important initiative of the Prime Minister in one single integrated online into the next step, which is embedded through a legislative process, would be an important, one important step forward to really mainstream the states. My last point on how to get states more actively involved is I want to go back to the point which I made earlier, namely that as we have taken on this very daunting challenge of moving towards a net zero, or being able to change what the Prime Minister has called life, which means the entire ecosystem surrounding the way in which we live, our economic activity patterns, what we eat, what we produce, how we produce, and this marvelous report, which I commend all of you to read, which has just come out last week by McKinsey on the important fact of how India can move towards a net zero, brings out the importance of the role of the state in India's ability to meet the daunting challenges of an orderly transition to an era of comparatively lower consumption of a fossil fuel dependent economy. Now, this is easier said than done, Nadir, apart from availability of land, which crucially depends on the benign attitude of state governments. It also depends on the fact of how do you really enable a transition which, in terms of the human and social consequences, minimize the degree of risk. As it happens, that coal production, and we need to have a coal plan certainly if you want to transit from the era of fossil fuel dependent energy transition. The bulk of the coal plants in India are located in the poorest parts of India. They are also one of the biggest employers in that area, in Bihar, in Jharkhand, in Odisha, in Madhya Pradesh. These are also not the most efficient coal plants. But as you move towards not only within the typology of the coal family itself into better and more efficient and less fossil fuel dependent kinds of coal, we need to take care in an orderly way which does not disrupt the people working there, which is not socially disruptive, which is an orderly transition to new forms of employment, because you may be able to protect the employment of people currently working, but there is a new generation. And we need to therefore work out a manner in which the states become very, very active players in this process. I'll give you an example, and I'll end with that. The example that when I visited Jharkhand, and Jharkhand is one of the biggest producers of coal, they told me about the environmental consequences of open coal burning and the degradation of human life. And then somebody pointed out to me from the representative of a press that, sir, there is a coal cess. I said, I know there is a coal cess, but we haven't seen the face of that cess, or at least that cess hasn't gone to the state of Jharkhand. So I think that raises a more important issue on the manner in which resources which are designed for a purpose and how to really make the decarbonization of the Indian economy is an important and a daunting quest. How do we decarbonize in a manner which also enables really to ensure that whatever is the tax and the benefits of the tax go also to states which perhaps are the worst sufferers from environmental degradation in this process. So I think that raises broader issues of sector-state relations, on the issues of cess and surcharge, and the way in which and whether they should or they should not be kept out of the divisible pool in a manner which the states would consider reasonable. Since it is outside the ambit of the Finance Commission's remit, I had to keep this aspect out of my report. But certainly, this is a matter which is in public domain on which we need to have a degree of consensus. So thank you very much, Nadir, for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much. And that was a very interesting point that says and all taxes on fossil fuels should be used for the transition. And the transition can be a replacement fuel, or it can also, if we need to benefit these states who produce coal and have lower incomes than other states, those mines could be used for sequestration of carbon dioxide, and the cess could be used to subsidize that.
Indeed, very innovative. Indeed, very innovative ideas. We need to think out of the box for what can be done for sequestration, for storage, and also for purposes of harnessing these resources, which then get freer.
Now I would like to ask you a question. The GST Council is a permanent establishment, but the Finance Commission is not. What problems does this cause?
Fortunately for me, these are problems of the past. And may my successor live in bliss. But on a more serious note, the Finance Commission, Nadir, is older than the Indian Constitution. Because prior to the adoption of the Indian Constitution, there was the issue of the sharing of resources. For the 3 years when you became independent, but the Constitution was still getting adopted. So during that period, there was an interim finance commission, which was in place, headed by none other than the great Mr. C.D. Deshmukh, whose names we are all very familiar with. Since then, it has been what the Constitution provides is that the President shall be expected to constitute a finance commission every 5 years, and that the government will ask the finance commission to give the issue on the sharing of the resources for such period as the government, as the President may consider appropriate. For the 15th Finance Commission, a somewhat unusual route was followed, that we gave our award for 6 years, were asked to give our award for 6 years instead of 5 years. So we made certain projections on how does Finance Commission work. I mean, in the one line, we pretend that we are, for that moment, astrologers who make forecasts on what is the likely trend on revenues and resources. Subsequent events may prove us wrong, but alas, there is no recourse mechanism, because once the Finance Commission has given their report, and the Parliament has accepted it, that's it, no matter whatever may happen to the real circumstances. On the other hand, the GST Council meets 3-4 times a year. They have the authority under the Constitution to recalibrate the rates of indirect taxes. This may or may not be always aligned with the astrological predictions which the Finance Commission may have made and gone away. Now, I think that the GST Council is still a very nascent body. We will need to see how it evolves before I venture to suggest any measures. But certainly, it is true that the Finance Commission is not a permanent body, but the GST Council is a permanent body. And should there be greater synchronization? Well, I was privileged that the GST Council invited me to, in person, share my views. Not that my views are very popular, because the GST Council, as you know, comprises of finance ministers of all states. And I am the equilibrator, or I was the equilibrator between the center and the states. So perhaps the composition of the GST Council itself doesn't augur very well for any view of the chairman of the Finance Commission to be held with acclamation. But anyway, I had the privilege to interact with them. The interactions are very useful. It certainly influenced me in one way, that you cannot have one size fits all. And it influenced me to do something unusual. It influenced me to give a disaggregated path on fiscal, debt management, and consequences of that specific to each state. And we did a special volume devoted only to the states. So if you wish to know, for instance, how has the state of Himachal, I say Himachal because it just had a poll, you can have in volume 4 of the Finance Commission's report, a separate pen portrait of Himachal's economy. So that interaction was exceedingly useful. So I think I have given you as diplomatic an answer to your question as is possible.
How are relations between the center and states ruled by opposition parties?
Well, you know, proof of pudding is in the eating. My political affiliations are known. It is not a secret that I am a member of the BJP, and was a member of the BJP when I was given the privilege by the government to chair the Finance Commission. But if you look at my award, as far as the division is concerned, between whether it should be between the what is called the vertical. The vertical means that how is the vertical arrived at? It's very simple. You take all the revenues, you pull them together in one basket. You call them the gross one. You take out the cost of collection being certified by the Controller and Auditor General of India. Then from that gross, you come to the divisible revenues. And what do you take out? You take out, for instance, dividends of public sector undertakings. You take out the revenues which the government would have earned from the Reserve Bank of India, giving some part to the government every year. You take out all cess and surcharge because that is what the Constitution implies. And by the way, that's not a very small amount now. It crept up. Now cess and surcharge is tantalizingly at one stage, year and a half ago, about 20% of it. So that you take out. Then you decide, looking at the expenditure of the states and the union, what is a reasonable split. Then that split, previous to the previous commission had decided the split to be, the split was 42%. I stuck to that same. It turned out to be 41 because we took out Jammu and Kashmir, which had by then become a union territory. So we lumped it in the category of grants to go to the Home Ministry. So this is the broad division. Then within the states, how do you decide? Within the states, you decide 4 or 5 parameters. You take population, you take geographical area, you take income distance, and then we had added a criteria of the forest cover to make it. So these are the 4 or 5 standard rules by which you go by. And these standard rules have a way in which there is no way in which you can play around with these standard rules. Once, I mean, you have a play, or whether I should give a weightage to, I had a very tricky problem, which I must share. I had the tricky problem that I was for the first time, after many, many years, asked to use the census data of which was the more contemporary census data. The latest census data was not available, but the census before that, which was available, I was asked to use that data. Prior to me, successive finance commissions had used the census data in 1972, and it was frozen there. So when I was asked to use the most recent census data, there were serious apprehensions, and brings me to the point of how the opposition states react to it. There were serious concerns by some of the states which had done better demographic management that we would be penalized if I was to give marks on account of population. Well, I had to give marks for population. It has always been done because, and ultimately resources must be used for human beings which exist. So if that state has so many human beings, this must be recognized by any commission. But they were apprehensive that if the weightage was high, then would they be penalized by better demographic management than states which had managed their demography. And by the way, better demographic management is easier said than done. It embeds in it the philosophy of better investment in girl-child education, in gender balance, and things of that kind, which brings about better demographic management. So anyway, this was a big issue and there were apprehensions. So I resolved it in a way in which I lowered the marks which I gave for population per se, and I introduced a criteria, demographic management. And by that, it was a tendency to kind and equalize. Last comment on this question is that in addition to all this stuff which I do, there is a thing called the revenue deficit grants. The revenue deficit grants are designed to really bridge the gap between any projections which have been made on the likely expenditure of the state for the period of the award, in this case 6 years, and the best assumption I can make on the likely revenue which the states will garner. And it is sought to bridge this gap between that through what are called revenue deficit grants. I ended up in giving nearly 3 lakh crore by revenue deficit grants. And by the way, and that answers now that your question, a very high proportion of the revenue deficit grants went to states which are not BJP ruled states. So I think that I have sought to live up to the legacy that finance commissions are looked upon as a political body of people who bring their best judgment in a judicious manner for the distribution of resources between the center and the states and among the states.
Thank you very much. One last question before we go to the audience. States are now thinking of setting up think tanks like Niti Aayog. What is your view on the role of these organizations?
Well, I think that in the old days, when the Planning Commission was there, you had state planning boards. I myself was privileged to head a state planning board. And now that the Planning Commission has gone, and you have the Niti Aayog which has come, I think that it is understandable that states would want to replicate this by having state level think tanks. By the way, I will support this for another reason. One of the things which as the Finance Commission chairman I encountered was that I wanted each of the states to have at least one research or one important aspect of the state social dimension to be gone into with some analytical domain knowledge. Many states do not have either think tanks or research organizations. So I think that if such a forward movement takes place, it will enhance their intellectual capability, it will enhance their domain knowledge, and it will improve the quality of analytical skills which goes into the economic policy making germane to that state.
Right. We can open it up for a few questions.
Sir, the way you pointed out about three sectors, agriculture, industry, manufacturing, and the service sector, you said 40% of population is involved and their contribution is 14%. I think that is the optimum. The way MS Swaminathan had a green revolution, later on he said we should have every year green revolution. And what happened to that green revolution? We had a multiple produce, but what happened to our chemical fertilizer and pesticide? That causes in Haryana, Punjab and other parts, water has become a carcinogenic. These people are suffering a lot. Second thing about our substitute to this green revolution, we should have a blue economy, which is very unexploited. Why not to focus on blue economy to take care of this, our agriculture? Thank you.
Your last sentence, can you repeat?
Yeah, we should have a blue economy much more tentative to have take care of the deficit of the agriculture, which is not so much effective.
You said blue economy.
Yes.
Ocean economy.
Yeah.
No, I agree with your suggestion that excessive use of groundwater, turning them into carcinogenic, really is injurious to health. It is injurious to environment. The answer lies in crop diversification, moving up the value-added chain, moving up the protein chain, of which a very important aspect is the blue economy, which will provide protein to substitute really. We will have a more balanced kind of a thing. Also, by the way, therefore, to move to fruits and horticulture, to fisheries, and most important, as I said, as far as cereals are concerned, go back to our ancient scriptures, go back to the fact that the world did not know present forms of rice and wheat, but certainly knew various forms of millet, the 6 kinds of millet, which requires much less water, much less fertilizer, more drought resistant, and really is far more nutritious with not only iron, but many other important vitamins. So I fully share with you that as part of an orderly transition to an era of less fossil fuel, the changing patterns of agriculture would be a central factor.
And I would like to add that using more trees for produce, fruits, as well as oil seeds that grow on trees that can provide protein and fat would help the ecology and produce more food and be much more sustainable. One, please. Yeah, please, I think we can hear you very clearly. Here it comes.
One of the things which is with growing economy that we are seeing is increased urbanization. Urban areas are giving 80% of GDP, 70% of pollution. The population is increasing to 40 to 50%, but the livability in urban areas are becoming more and more challenging. So how did the Finance Commission deal with the urban challenges, and how does it look forward in terms of the governance and expenditure of the resources that have been provided for urban management by the municipal bodies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very important point that you have raised, and I'm grateful that you have raised it because it has allowed me an opportunity to make one or two comments on this very important. First and foremost, let me say that we recognize fully that urbanization is an important engine of growth, that urbanization has a degree of inevitability associated with a growing process. At the same time, disorderly urban patterns have injurious to health and have got downside in terms of its growth potential. So what do we need? Let me give you an example. One of the examples is, suppose you asked yourself the question, how many, India's population has grown enormously. We still continue to grow. We will continue to grow for several decades before the population begins to decline. How many new cities have been created in India? How many? Well, one of them, the most iconic one, Amravati, which is in everybody's lips, has run into a difficulty. I visited Amravati several times to try and resolve the difficulties between the Singaporean investors and the government there. With Singaporeans didn't realize that India has a different pattern. Our democracy is much more robust, and our democracy, periodic elections can bring periodic surprises. And so whatever that might be, the fact remains that Amravati is one city. Chandrababu Naidu tried to expand Hyderabad in a major way. But go on, how many newer cities have been created? So the Finance Commission recognized this. We have therefore given a robust grant for seed capital, which could bring about new cities. And I hope that the Ministry of Urban Development can really use this money imaginatively through a competition process, which we have put in our thing, to make these grants available to states so that new cities can really reduce the kind of unplanned urbanization and the congestion which we have. So that was one initiative which we could do. Second important, you mentioned about the third tier. I took my obligations on the third tier rather seriously. I visited all the 28 states, and I had intensive interactions with the third tier. It was part of this embedded program. We came across many things. Now, for the urban local bodies, the very important difficulty today is after the GST, they feel that they do not have adequate resources, because a lot of the taxes which they had are embedded now in the GST. Of course, the state governments get the advantage of that, and it is for the state governments to really pass on the benefit of that. But as far as an individual urban local body is concerned, he finds that except for one or two things, he has very little. But I think that we did put a special chapter on property tax, which we believe is a very, very important source of revenue for urban local bodies, whose potential has not been adequately appreciated, much less realized. And we have therefore some very robust recommendations on urban local bodies. Third, I think that instead of giving untied grants, looking at the national priorities, both for rural panchayats and urban local bodies, we have given a substantial amount of the resources which have gone as tied funds, tied to programs which are linked with the national objectives and the national program. One final comment. And that's this, that goes beyond this question which you asked, but connected with that. You know, when, Nadla, end with that, when the 74th, 75th Amendment was adopted, which they really gave the constitutional aspects to the third tier of governance. It was expected that the Finance Commission would not be giving financial resources in perpetuity, but each state government would constitute, just like the Finance Commission of India, they would be constituting state finance commissions every 5 years. And just as the president is obliged to constitute a national finance commission every 5 years, each governor is obliged to constitute a state finance commission. Unfortunately, this is a factor where quite a few states have lagged behind, constituting state finance commissions, adopting and discussing and deliberating their reports with the seriousness which it deserves, and acting on the recommendations with the same alacrity as the states expect the central government to act on the recommendations of the National Finance Commission. So I think that's an area where I think symmetry of action would really contribute to the overall polities, economic development dynamics. So I think that that's the way in which I look at it. But thanks for raising the issue of urbanization, and incubating new urban cities is an aspect to which we need to devote. One more I should have added in the list of Amravati and Neemrana came up. Atal Nagar, Neemrana. So whatever it is, I mean, it's an important thing that, but how many can you count? Look at the most populous parts of India. Look at the way in which cities are bulging out. And that's not really orderly urbanization in any way. And we have the skills, we have the capability. They are capable of being great employers. I think that we're losing out on that if we do not really act on orderly urbanization. And really it is for the states to take the adequate step, not be dependent on the central government. Of course, the funds which have gone and recognizing that the state governments may be lax, I didn't want the urban local bodies to suffer. I didn't want the local panchayats to suffer. So I did make a very hefty devolution to the third tier, and be it said to the credit of the central government that they accepted those awards in totality, and urban local bodies have no reasons to really complain, nor the panchayats, of inadequacy of financial resources. But thank you for raising that issue.
I've got one last question.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. My name is Sharath. I am working in power sector, and I am at the forefront of a lot of center-state disputes, because at the power sector, we see constant disagreements and disputes arising. And part of the reason what I have observed over the last decade is that policies are there, consistencies are there, but eventually they are always related to whether governments at the center and states are they well coordinated or not. And based on my, if we talk about pre-2014 era and after that, there has been a lot of change with respect to the establishment of GST Council and all. But in spite of all that reforms, we still see a lot of inconsistencies, and this is eventually leading to, I would say, bad money or loss of confidence from private sector participation in the power sector. How would you look at it from a, with your experience, how would you look way forward for this, so that there will be less number of issues related to disputes and disagreements, because eventually I think private sector participation in power sector has been dwindling on that part, especially related to, because based on kind of inputs, policy inputs given, they are only private sector participation has been mostly in that direction. Thank you.
That's a big question. It's a big enough question for one full session or maybe a day. I would not like to make naive comments on it for three reasons. First, I have been chairman of an electricity board, perhaps India's most impoverished electricity board, and knows those woes. Second, I was heading the energy and power in the erstwhile planning commission, and then subsequently working with the Prime Minister, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee as his secretary. Power was one of the areas in which I took keen interest in power purchase agreements and crafting some of that. Gajendra Haldia was a junior colleague of mine who wrote a lot of stuff on power. I would say that the recent steps of the government are indeed very commendable. I think that the current power minister, fortunately, is the Minister for Power and Renewable Energy, although coal is not in his purview. But some of the recent steps which have been taken to reduce the irritations on power are steps in the right direction. But where you are absolutely right, the bottom line is this. To whichever state I went, there was one giant elephant in that room. What was that giant elephant? Unpaid dues on the power sector by generating companies being impoverished by not getting it from power distribution companies. And this is embedded in a whole lot of things, whether state level power regulators are genuinely independent, tariff fixation orders are given timely, tariff fixation orders are carried out, the bill collection cycle is regular, and all this matrix tallies out. With the result that if you look at year after year, I chaired the APDP, Accelerated Power Development Program. I chaired the APDRP1, APDRP2, APDRP3, and then of course you had the Uday 1 and Uday 2. But that is an endemic issue. That endemic issue is now being addressed, in my view, with some of the legislative changes which have been introduced in a very significant way. I commend the efforts under Mr. Prime Minister Modi and the present power minister who has worked with me earlier in a different capacity, that hopefully these will see some very positive outcomes. I'll tell you one very important factor. My autobiography, and I'm not making a pitch for any of you to buy that book, but in my autobiography, one of the things I have dealt with about my conversations with the present Prime Minister, Mr. Modi. And he did say, and he has stuck by that commitment, I will not give free power, I will give you assured power. It's for you to decide whether you want assured regular power as a source of energy, or do you want free power? I will not go more into it, except to say that I do not subscribe to the culture of freebies, because I subscribe in the culture of higher economic growth, better life quality, and of ensuring that you are able to get private capital with the same alacrity with which you expect public capital.
Thank you very much, N.K. Singh. I'm sure you will all agree with me that we have heard a tour de force on India's center-state relationships, as well as a seminar on many economic ideas for India to go forward. And we will take those home with us. And thank you very much for this.
Whatever you like. This is the least, is the next, is the next.